Your family stories matter. Preserve them forever with a custom video interview from Persona. Our team of journalists will ask all the right questions and produce a video you'll treasure. For more information, go to personacustominterviews.com. Hi everyone, welcome back to Persona Interviews. I'm Rob Simmelcare. We're going to continue our series of interviews with people running for local office here in Westport, Connecticut. Our next interview was conducted by my colleague Jen Berniker. She sat down with candidate for the Board of Education, Vic Muktavaram.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vic. It's really nice to get to talk to you. So I wanted to get right to it and talk about the topic on everyone's mind, which is redistricting. I know there's a lot to say and you can't say it all here, and it's time specific, but if you could just tell us, why do we need redistricting and when do we need it?
Thank you, thank you for having me. So before we actually get into redistricting, I want to talk about something, in my opinion, which is much more fundamental in terms of the rationale and the timing, which you touched on. So historically, we have had 5 teams across the 2 middle schools. And if you think about the current situation at the combined middle school, we have 4.5 teams. If the Board of Education does nothing, it's likely that we'll go back to a 4.5 team model across 2 schools, but separate. In which case, Coley Middle, being the small school, is likely to get the 1.5 team versus the 2 teams that they used to have previously. So, as the middle school principals have argued about this passionately, and most administrators have said this, the half-team model is quote-unquote subpar compared to a full-team model. So I'm keen that when we reopen CMS, that we go back to full-team models at both middle schools. Now, then the redistricting conversation becomes relevant. So historically, one of the issues that we have had at CMS when we had 2 full teams there and 3 teams at Bedford is that because of the declining enrollment, the average class size, if you will, at CMS has been lower than at BMS. And as the enrollment has declined, one of the things that has happened is that the discrepancy has grown quite large, to the extent that in some classes you could have almost 15 students at CMS, whereas you could have 25, 27 classes at BMS. And this is not considering some of the higher level math classes, which potentially could have upwards of 30 at BMS. So that leads to 2 kinds of issues. One is the delivery of the education within a classroom itself could be different, because small classes versus big classes have different deliveries you may have to consider. And the other thing is, as classes shrink, class sizes shrink at CMS, our ability to offer the same kind of programming may also diminish for efficiency purposes. So because of that, there was a reason to consider redistricting in terms of our ability to offer two things. One is the full teams at both schools, as well as maintaining the similar class sizes at 2. So that's sort of the reason why we had to consider. Now, this is where the redistricting conversation gets interesting, is as the Board of Education considered redistricting, one of the things that also came into play is that as we are, because combined with the desire to redistrict, when we looked at the budget, there was also, because of combined with the enrollment numbers or the declining enrollment numbers, the board has felt that perhaps there might be a need to go from 5 teams to 4 teams, because we don't want to support half the teams, so our decision becomes either 5 or 4. So this further gets interesting, because as we look at the enrollment numbers, the numbers themselves are changing. As I mentioned earlier, historically, if you looked at the numbers, while the CMS enrollment, the enrollment across Westport has been declining, one of the things we find with the enrollment numbers is that the CMS numbers actually are holding steady, whereas the BMS numbers are declining. So what has happened because of that is, if we, and Liz and I think it's fair to say that we have probably looked at these numbers more than anybody has in Westport. And so I can say this with some degree of confidence, that as we looked at or analyzed the numbers, last year's projections, the conclusion that I came to is that if you want to maintain 5 full teams at both schools, and we also want to have similar class sizes, the number that we need to redistrict from BMS to CMS is around 50. Now, When we look at current enrollment numbers, what happens is that if you want to maintain 5 full teams, there is actually not a reason to redistrict because the numbers have shrunk on the BMS side. Therefore, the average class sizes actually even out across BMS and CMS. So then, which becomes then for the board, then the questions becomes a less of a parity issue because the average class size is the same, and we are able to offer 2 full teams at CMS and 3 full teams at BMS. Then it becomes more a question of budget rather than disparity. So my view, and I think Liz and I share this view, is that because the numbers are in flux, this is not a great time to be aggressive and go to 4 teams from 5 teams. Our inclination, and I support this, is that I think we should continue to look at the numbers, and when there is a trend, perhaps there might be a better time to redistrict. And the advantage of doing that is over time there may be a natural rebalancing that might occur on its own, and there may not be a need to redistrict at all, and we could be able to get to 4 teams on its own.
Okay, so redistricting possibly in the future. Right now, better to wait and see how everything lands. And from what you're saying, it sounds like you fully are committed to 2 middle schools. Is that right?
Correct. I'm committed to 2 middle schools, but I'm also committed to maintaining full teams at both middle schools.
Okay. Obviously, this has not been an easy year, so can you just tell me why you're running again for Board of Ed?
Mostly because I feel, like when I look back at my role over the last 3.5 years, one of the things that I found is that many a time I've been a dissenting voice on the board. And that's not because, I wanted to dissent for the sake of dissenting, but I thought that I was bringing a different voice to the discussion. Sometimes it could be a minority voice that's not heard on the board. There could be a fragment of the community that's not represented on the board. Sometimes I felt that I was representing that. Sometimes it is just a different way of thinking because of my background. So it's because we have had strong leadership who brought in ideas. I thought what I brought to the table was that sort of a different way of looking at things. And going forward, what I think I can bring to the table is continue to look at things differently, but also sort of an analytic way of looking at things, taking into account the community input and different things.
How can you build consensus, though? How can you work with everyone else when there's so often differing opinions?
Oftentimes, there may not be a consensus, but my view is that, and this is borne out from both academic literature and sort of literature on the business strategies and things, is that oftentimes having a dissenting voice actually ultimately improves decision making. So having a different perspective gives a voice to people who may not, especially there is when there is a majority, oftentimes people don't rise up and speak. But having one person speak up actually leads to other people coming up with different points of view, whether or not they agree with me, but more voices rise up to sort of have a fuller discussion. Yeah, so I think that is important.
That's great. Unrelated to redistricting in middle schools, there's also the issue of school start time is up for debate right now. Why do we need to adjust the school start times, and will this happen in the near future, do you think?
I personally hope so. I was actually on the start time committee. We spent about close to 6 or 8 months discussing various academic literature, and we heard from experts who have advocated that as adolescents, I think it's helpful for them to have later start times. So, but one of the things that we struggled with was sort of balancing later start times with some of the sports programs that we would be bumping against at the end of the school day. So as a quote-unquote, it's a compromise, but I think it's a worthwhile compromise where we have, at least we wanted to get to at least half an hour of late start time, and that was unanimously voted by the start time committee. And I'm looking forward to that, having that a fuller discussion at the board.
Do you think that they're going to get something done? It's been discussed for a while.
That's my hope. Obviously, from a board perspective, we also have to think about other considerations. For example, some people have 2 working parents, so they may have other considerations where it might make it a bit more challenging. But from everything that I hear, I think it's something that we should discuss, but my hope is ultimately we can get to a later start time, hopefully soon.
Okay, so Coley Middle School. What happens if the current schedule slips or if things come in over budget? What's going to happen?
So I can talk from a process perspective. If it slips, I think currently the allocation or the appropriation approval is for $32 million. If it goes over that, technically they'll have to go back to the funding bodies to get an approval. What will likely happen is that they would perhaps come back to Board of Education and probably have a trade-off conversation, meaning if there are certain things that we could take off the table that are probably a lower priority. So, but my hope is that that's not the case. My hope is that we come in under budget and on time, and I'm rooting for Coley Middle School to open by August 2020.
And it's on schedule right now?
Currently, I mean, the way the plan is working is what it has been planned for. I know there's a lot of anxiety, or I've heard that some people are anxious because we don't see the wrecking crew, if you will, at the site. But the plan is on schedule as it was designed. So I think we are on target so far. But again, being construction, there are always risks in terms of schedule. But it's managed. Overall, it's managed by the building committee, and I think they're doing a great job. And what I really hope is, one of the things that I said when we were having this discussion is that the only way we can get this done is if we unify as a town and get behind this project. So the number one concern that I have is about distractions. That I hope that we don't have distractions that would sort of take our focus away from actually getting the building open. And we have had some of those things that we have had to deal with. That I feel, from a board perspective, I think that's where we have to be as collaborative as possible to get it done.
Great. I think that's all we have time for, but I really appreciate talking to you.
Thank
and
you.
Good luck to you guys.
Pleasure.